It should have been a great day of triumph for Airbus. Their brand new Airbus A320 was to shake up the world of aviation with its modern and computerized flight controls. At an air show held in a French town, the capabilities of this brand new marvel of engineering should have been demonstrated in an impressive way. The many spectators on that day were thrilled to see the A320 approaching very low at just about 10 meters above the ground. But amazement soon changed to horror as the airliner failed to climb away after it had passed the runway end. Instead, it crashed into an adjacent forest, erupting in a great fireball. What happened here? Was maybe that brand new aircraft to blame, or was there something else at play? Let's find out. Welcome to Airspace. The time around June 1988 was a very special one for Air France. After years of development, the airline was finally able to take delivery of its very first and brand new Airbus A320 planes. The jet was very welcome at the airline, seeing that it was very modern, economic and, most of all, developed and in part manufactured in France itself. To celebrate the occasion, Air France had agreed to present one of its new aircraft at an air show in Habsheim, a town located in eastern France. Thousands of spectators were eager to welcome the newcomer. On the morning of June 26, 1988, the two pilots of Air France Flight 296 Quebec met for flight planning. Both, Captain Michel Asselin and First Officer Pierre Massière, held managerial positions and were part of the team that helped Air France introduce the new aircraft, so they were very familiar with the new plane. The plan for today was to fly from Paris Charles de Gaulle to Basel Mulhouse, where the crew would pick up passengers for the short flight to Habsheim, where two low passes over the runway would be performed. After this, the pilots would fly to the Alps for a sightseeing flight, followed by a return to Basel. After 130 passengers had boarded the aircraft that had been delivered to Air France just 2 days before, the two pilots taxied to the departure runway. While doing so, the captain briefed the first officer on how he would perform the flyover. His plan was to fly at just 100 feet or 30 meters above Habsheim's runway 02, with flaps extended to position 3 of 4 and the landing gear down. At this very low height, the captain would then decelerate the A320 by reducing engine power to idle and raising the nose more and more until the aircraft's automatic protection systems would allow no more. Then, the first officer would assist him in maintaining the required thrust on the engines so that the plane would fly level at the maximum angle of attack. A complicated maneuver, but it could work if executed well and correctly. Soon after this briefing, the A320 took off for its very short flight to the air show. 2 minutes after departure, Captain Asselin had already initiated the descent towards the airfield. He came in a little high and fast, and the pilots were not immediately able to visually locate the airfield. When they finally spotted it, they realized that spectators had not gathered around runway 02 as expected, but around grass runway 34 right. This necessitated a late low-level turn towards that runway, increasing the workload of the pilots. In the meantime, the aircraft had descended to just 100 feet above the ground, still at a descent rate of 600 feet per minute. The first officer warned the captain about this fact, and eventually, the captain managed to level the plane off at just 30 feet or 9 meters above the ground. At that height, the plane made its approach to fly over runway 34 right. The engines of the Airbus A320 were at idle, and the captain worked hard to maintain the altitude by raising the nose more and more while bleeding off speed. Spectators were delighted to see the new A320 flying just meters above the runway. But as the aircraft closed in on the runway end and the small forest beyond, it became clear that something was very wrong. To the shock of spectators, the A320 did not climb, but it just continued straight ahead into the treetops while the engines accelerated. The plane disappeared into the forest while terrible sounds of breaking trees and tearing metal could be heard. Just seconds later, a fireball emerged above the trees, bearing witness to the fact that the aircraft had crashed horribly. Firefighters and medical teams that had been stationed at the airshow immediately set off into the forest, but due to the dense vegetation, only the smaller vehicles were able to reach the burning wreckage. Luckily, it seemed that most occupants were able to leave the burning A320. The plane burned fiercely, and a few hours after the crash, it was almost completely consumed by fire, save for the tailplane. In the evening, it also became clear that not everybody had made it out alive. A boy suffering from a physical disability and a young girl were unable to open their seatbelts on their own in time. A woman who saw their struggles returned to the cabin to help them, but was overcome by thick smoke. All three were found dead inside the wreckage. The investigation that followed was of course followed closely by the public. Had this new aircraft, or more precisely, its control systems, been to blame for this terrible accident? Billions were on the line for Airbus. Let's take a close look at the accident sequence to find out what happened. When the A320 approached the airshow, engine power was reduced to idle and flaps and the landing gear were extended. Then, Captain Aslin leveled the A320 off at a lower than intended height, namely at 30 instead of 100 feet. At this height, the captain intended to fly level while bleeding off speed and raising the nose until the A320's protection systems would allow no more. The aircraft's high angle of attack protection was something novel in civil airliners at the time. Contrary to conventional control systems, the A320's fly-by-wire system can filter pilot commands electronically in certain conditions. These functions are called protections. The high angle of attack protection seeks, as the name says, to limit the aircraft's angle of attack at a value that is smaller than the stall angle of attack. That way, a dangerous stall, that is in simple terms, the loss of lift at high angles of attack, should be avoided. If a pilot ever reaches this maximum angle of attack, intentionally or unintentionally, the protections will kick in and block any attempts to raise the nose of the aircraft higher than it is deemed safe, even if the pilot commands more nose up. Captain Aslin wanted to show this protection in action to the world. As he pulled back on the side stick while the plane was flying level over the runway at idle thrust, the maximum angle of attack was reached. Since the plane was flying below 100 feet, the engines did not automatically provide maximum thrust. This function is disabled at this height, and the pilots knew this. They specifically wanted to disable this function and control thrust themselves, but that was not necessary. In this configuration, the plane flew towards the runway end and the forest beyond. Finally, the crew spotted the trees and the captain reacted promptly by applying maximum thrust and pulling the side stick all the way back. But nothing seemed to happen. To the pilots, the next 5 seconds must have felt like eternity. Since the large engines were at flight idle, that is about 29% of the maximum rotation speed, it took them a while to spin up to the maximum thrust that the captain had commanded. Also, the plane was unable to raise its nose and climb, since the aircraft had already reached its maximum permissible angle of attack while it was overflying the runway. The captain had flown and commanded it that way. So, with the engine spinning up, the aircraft flew level while the engine thrust slowly increased. The plane hit the treetop's tail first, then started descending slowly into the forest. The engines ingested branches and leaves, stalled and were destroyed, making a recovery impossible. The wings were torn open and fuel spilled and ignited quickly, resulting in the huge fireball spectators saw. The final report, when finally published, left no doubt about the cause of the accident. The pilots had brought the aircraft in dangerously low. Even if they had flown the aircraft perfectly at 100 feet instead of just 30 feet, that would have been lower than the 170 feet of minimum height that French regulations dictate. Also, the final flyover height was lower than the surrounding obstacles, which was very unwise. Still, the maneuver the pilots intended to fly was not impossible. Had they flown it at a stabilized speed with thrust at higher values than idle, engine response would have been much faster and a steady climb would have been possible. Also, had the flight crew reacted earlier, maybe the engines would have had sufficient time to accelerate. To sum it up, the pilots came in too low, too slow, and reacted too late. They had also been ill prepared for the demonstration flight, which was partially the fault of Air France's dispatch office. It provided a very thin and lackluster briefing package, which did for example not contain any contact information to the organizers of the event, nor any depiction of the trees at the runway end of runway 34 right. In the court hearings that followed, the captain tried to defend his actions over and over. He used several different arguments. In one, he stated that the engines had not responded as it was to be expected, and that the engine computers were at fault. In another, he stated that the flight data recorders had been tampered with, and that evidence was altered so that it made him look bad and the aircraft look good. He blamed it all on Airbus and the company's desire to keep the record of its new plane clean. The court ruled that his claims were false, ungrounded and defamatory. Captain Aslin was fined and had to publicly retract his statements. He was finally convicted to a 6-month prison sentence and 6 months on probation. He appealed to this decision, but the appeal was rejected and his sentence was increased to 10 months of imprisonment, along with 10 months of probation. His first officer received a suspended 12-month sentence. There were other sentences as well, for example for the organizer of the air show. Some media outlets picked up on the allegation that the flight data recorders allegedly were tampered with or even switched out. Claims were based on this photograph of the accident site. On the right edge, you can see a man carrying what seems to be flight data and cockpit voice recorders. On this image of the recorders presented in court, you can see them in more detail. The photograph of the accident site was enlarged by a forensic institute in Switzerland to take a closer look at what the man was carrying. Analysts of the institute were convinced that the recorders in the picture of the accident site were not the ones presented in court. According to them, the white stripes on the flight data recorder are at right angles to the edge of the recorder in the photo taken from the helicopter over the wreck. The stripes of the recorders presented in court, however, are diagonal. All this of course fueled conspiracy theories that in part stand to this day. Did Airbus indeed try to cover up a malfunction of its flight or engine control systems? How meaningful is an enhancement of a blurry 1980s picture in this case? I, for one, believe the official version of events. It makes a lot of sense to me. The pilots recklessly flew low, slow and unprepared and eventually found themselves in an aerodynamic corner where they were unable to escape from in due time. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, make sure to check out my Patreon page. I have many cool benefits for as little as $3 per month. Your contribution greatly helps me to grow this channel and bring you all these interesting cases. Link is right here in the outro or in the description. Thank you all so much for watching and see you all in the next one.